Do you want to move in closer?
You go now.
The 60-year world crash cycle is just a subdivision of a 960-year cycle. The Abano cycle, which we shall call the A cycle, that was discovered by Peter of Abano in the year 1200. The Middle Ages was a time when they ran up churches that turned from 330 feet into 300 feet in height. And exactly 960 years later, men landed on the moon. And in 480 years' time, there will be another boom. This is the period of crisis, the Dark Ages, the so-called Renaissance, which is a time of religious anxiety, and the age of darkness that lies in the future. Dark, gold, the Dark Age, the Golden Age, the Dark Age, the Gold Age. Also, cold and heat, cold and heat. Of course, we're having global warming right now. We'll soon hit a global freeze. This is the period of crisis that leads to experiment, that leads to invention. Here is the period where one exploits the inventions. This was a period of crisis that led to the invention of very efficient agriculture and skyscraper-type architecture during the Middle Ages. It lasts 60 years. It divides exactly into the A cycle. It's named after Kondratiev, a Russian economist murdered by Stalin in 1930 for predicting the periodic creative destruction of capitalism, but not the complete destruction. Schumpeter published Kondratiev's works in the late 20s, predicting the world crash, which took place down here, shall we say. Boom, bust, and during this period of about, shall we say, 30 years, we had a terrible crisis, the Second World War. But then came the boom period of the 60s, and then another crash round about 1989. So you get 1689, 1929, 1989, and that 2049. This explains why a world depression struck in 1990 that made 700 million people. It robbed them of 20%, of 50% of their domestic wealth. Because it happened to the Slavs, to the Japanese, and the South Asians, no one on the North Atlantic noticed this depression. But this was depression, depression, depression. Right now, we're in something called a recession. But we can look at this cycle the other way around. Here we may see the year of the crash may be seen as the peak of the cycle, if you wish. 1809, then suddenly, halfway through, we get free trade and the amazing boom that followed 1847. This was the period of the so-called efficient market, the heroic age of capitalism, the age of Dickens, Karl Marx and Darwin. Abruptly, the crash that Marx predicted 18 months earlier in Das Kapital occurred in 1869, 18 months after the publication of Das Kapital. There then comes the world crash right down to here. It lasted till 1898. There then followed a tripling of wages between 1898 and 1917, which had to be clawed back through the miners' strike of the 1920s. Look at this ferocious expansion, right up to 1929. Crash again. Kondratiev struck from outer space. Here Kondratiev was murdered. Stalin killed him. Down again, the triumph of the Soviet and of communism. It spreads over something like nearly 40% of the world's population. 1960 is the beginning of another ferocious expansion. This time the ferocious expansion leading up to the world crash of 1989. So this is the way to look at the present recession. That's the K cycle, that's Kondratiev. Is there not another cycle? The next cycle is the G cycle, named after W.D. Gann, a famous American speculator, very successful. This is a 20-year cycle, which you get by dividing the Kondratiev by 3. So we get Kondratiev 1929, Gann 1950, Gann 1970, Kondratiev crash 1990, Gann recession 2010. So you get depression, recession, recession, depression, recession. Now that's not difficult to follow. But the average economist has no idea that this really exists. I predicted this crash in June of 2006 and deposited the dates, even the exact week of its onset, with the Bodleian at Oxford. O is for oil and optimism. The O cycle is 12 years in length. Henry Adams discovered the political version of the O cycle in 1866, described in Arthur M. Schlesinger's The Cycles of American History, Chapter 2. I myself spotted this was an oil cycle, where you get boom and bust with the oil prices. Also an optimism cycle. However, I was beaten to the draw by the creator of Kubla Khan, because Samuel Taylor Coleridge discovered the same cycle as an economic pulse back around 1810. Not a lot of people know that. Well, they know it now. 1973, therefore, was a very low year for oil prices. Why then did they quadruple? The answer is they did not quadruple. They only went up about 5%, I think. It was because the oil price was so low that a world crisis was created in oil prices. They did not quadruple until 6 years later. 6 years later, around 1980, that's when they quadrupled. Then we get low oil again, then we get an oil boom, and I predicted the low oil for 2009. Oil prices will be very high again up here. Let me lay one fallacy to death. Economists are very shallow, trivial, mechanical thinkers. They will tell you that when the price of oil goes down, it stimulates the economy. It can't. Because when the price of oil goes down, the international mood is also very low. That may be one reason why the price is so low. They cannot understand cause and effect. They don't think holistically. They don't think in terms of quantal causality. I told you before, economics is dialectic. Now let's explain the current crash. In 1989 came the Kondratiev. We're still suffering the after effects. In 2009, the O cycle hit bottom. In 2010, the G cycle hit bottom. In 2011, the 18.6, the housing cycle, shall hit bottom. The housing stock of the world does not hit official bottom till the 11th of the 11th of the 11th. The whale is comatose. It doesn't matter how much you pump the economy. The whale must remain comatose till the 4th of July 2012. We must not disturb the healthy cycles of the universe.